One of the world's most famous airline captains announced he's living with Alzheimer's disease. Captain Sully recently revealed his diagnosis.
There are certain names that stop being just names and become shorthand for something larger. For most of the world, the name Sullenberger stopped being a name a long time ago and became a symbol instead. A symbol of calm when everything around a person is falling apart. For 16 years, that has been the story people told about him. The pilot who brought a broken plane down onto a river in the middle of a winter afternoon and walked away having saved every single soul on board. But this month, the man behind that symbol asked the world to see him differently. Not as a legend frozen in a single afternoon in January of 2009, but as a 75-year-old man now facing a battle that no amount of training, discipline, or composure can fully prepare anyone for. Captain Sully Sullenberger has revealed that he is living with early-stage Alzheimer's disease, and in doing so, he has once again chosen to turn a private, frightening moment into something the public can learn from. To understand why this news landed with such weight, it helps to remember where this story actually began, long before an Airbus ever lost both engines over New York City. Chesley Burnett Sullenberger III was born in January of 1951 in Denison, Texas, a small city that gave little hint of the outsized role its son would eventually play on the world stage. His family carried Swiss-German roots that stretched back generations, and the household he grew up in valued quiet discipline far more than attention or noise. As a boy, he was consumed by flight in the purest, most old-fashioned way, building model planes, watching military jets streak overhead from a nearby airbase, and dreaming about what it might feel like to be the one in the cockpit rather than the one looking up. He was also, by any measure, an exceptional student, sharp enough academically to qualify for Mensa before he was even a teenager, and driven enough to graduate near the very top of his high school class, while also leading the Latin club and playing first-chair flute. Even then, there were two sides of him developing side by side: the meticulous, disciplined mind, and the quiet dreamer who wanted to fly. By the time he was a teenager, he was no longer just dreaming about flight. He was living it. He earned his glider license before he could legally drive a car unsupervised, and not long after that, he was flying a small single-engine plane out of a modest airstrip near his family's home. That early experience carried him directly into the United States Air Force Academy, where he didn't just study flying, he excelled at it, eventually becoming an instructor pilot for fellow cadets while still a student himself. When he graduated, he did so as the top flyer in his class, a distinction that would end up defining the shape of the rest of his life. From there, the Air Force sent him to Purdue, where he studied the psychology of how people behave and make decisions under pressure, a subject that might have seemed academic at the time, but would later prove to be the exact expertise he needed on one unforgettable afternoon decades later. He went on to fly fighter jets, rising to the rank of captain, and quietly built a reputation not just as a skilled pilot, but as someone deeply interested in why accidents happen and how they can be prevented. When he left the military and moved into commercial aviation, that interest in safety never faded. If anything, it deepened. Over 3 decades flying for U.S. Airways and its predecessor airlines, he became far more than a line pilot. He served as a flight instructor, worked as an investigator for the National Transportation Safety Board, held leadership roles focused on safety within his pilots' union, and helped shape training programs that airlines still rely on today. He was, in every sense, a student of catastrophe long before he ever had to prevent one himself. He studied what goes wrong in cockpits, how communication breaks down under stress, and how well-prepared crews manage to bring people home safely even when everything else is falling apart. None of the passengers who boarded his flights over those years likely gave much thought to the man's background. They just heard a calm, steady voice on the intercom. They had no idea that voice belonged to someone who had spent an entire adult life quietly preparing for a crisis he hoped would never come. Then, on the afternoon of January 15th, 2009, it came. Sullenberger was in command of U.S. Airways Flight 1549, an Airbus climbing out of LaGuardia Airport on a routine trip to Charlotte, North Carolina. Barely 2 minutes into the flight, the aircraft struck a flock of Canada geese, and both engines lost power almost simultaneously. In an instant, Sullenberger and his first officer, Jeffrey Skiles, went from flying a normal commercial jet to gliding a powerless aircraft directly over one of the most densely populated cities on the planet. Air traffic control offered him the option of turning back to LaGuardia or diverting to a smaller airport nearby. But Sullenberger quickly determined neither runway could be reached safely in time. In the span of only a few seconds, drawing on decades of training and instinct, he made the decision to bring the plane down on the Hudson River instead. What followed has since become one of the most studied emergency landings in the history of aviation. Sullenberger later admitted that the silence of the engines cutting out was a genuinely shocking sound, and that the seconds leading up to touchdown produced a feeling of dread unlike anything he had experienced in his entire flying career. And yet the landing itself was smooth enough that the plane stayed largely intact on the surface of the water, giving all 155 people on board the precious minutes they needed to evacuate onto the wings and into the small boats that arrived almost immediately. Before he allowed himself to leave the sinking aircraft, Sullenberger walked the length of the cabin twice to be certain no one remained behind. He was the very last person off the plane. Investigators later concluded that his decision to ditch in the river, rather than attempt to return to either airport, was the correct call given the circumstances, and the world quickly agreed that something extraordinary had just happened in the skies over New York. The reaction that followed was swift and enormous. He received a personal call from the sitting president, an invitation to the presidential inauguration just days later, formal recognition from Congress, and a standing ovation during the Super Bowl pregame show only weeks after the landing. New York City handed him a key to the city. Time magazine placed him among the most influential people of the year. For a man who friends and colleagues describe as naturally shy and reserved, that sudden explosion of global attention was, in its own way, almost as disorienting as the crash landing itself. But rather than retreat from that attention once the initial wave of headlines faded, Sullenberger made a deliberate choice that would define the next chapter of his life. He decided to use the platform, not simply enjoy it. He continued flying commercially for another year before retiring in 2010, closing out a 30-year career with one final flight alongside Skiles and several passengers who had been on Flight 1549 with him. From there, his life took on a new shape entirely. He co-wrote a best-selling memoir that went far beyond the Hudson River landing, opening up about his father's death by suicide years earlier and the private grief that followed, a disclosure that eventually turned him into an outspoken advocate for suicide prevention. That memoir would later become the basis for a major Hollywood film starring Tom Hanks, introducing an entirely new generation to a story many assumed they already knew in full. He went on to serve as an aviation safety analyst for a national news network, address world leaders at international forums on crisis decision-making, and testify before Congress on aircraft safety standards, becoming one of the most persistent public voices demanding accountability after a series of tragic commercial airline crashes overseas. In 2021, he was nominated to serve as the United States Ambassador to the International Civil Aviation Organization, a role that placed the former airline captain directly at the center of global conversations about flight safety, and one he carried out with the same quiet seriousness that had defined his entire career. Away from the podiums and the testimony, his personal life stayed remarkably steady. He married his wife, Lori, in 1989, and together they raised 2 daughters in California, building an ordinary family life that stood in sharp, almost startling contrast to his public reputation. Friends have long said that contrast is the truest way to understand who he really is. A man capable of extraordinary composure in front of the entire world, who then went home most evenings to homework, dinner, and the small rituals of raising children. That long, layered history is exactly why this week's announcement carries so much emotional weight. In a personal statement shared publicly, Sullenberger explained that he was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease last year, after he began noticing small but troubling changes in his own memory, moments where names didn't come as easily as they once had, catching himself repeating a story he had already told, and nights of disrupted sleep that felt different from ordinary tiredness. He chose to describe all of it in plain, direct language rather than softening it or dressing it up, in much the same way he once described the mechanics of a water landing rather than romanticizing it. He shared that he has been working closely with a specialist at UCSF Medical Center in San Francisco, and that the diagnosis pushed him to reconsider what it means to keep serving others at this stage of his life. He explained that for years, whenever people asked him about the outcome of Flight 1549, he liked to say that courage can be contagious, and that he now believes the same idea applies to how a person faces a disease like this one. Rather than retreating into privacy, he framed his decision to speak openly as an attempt to spare other families some of the isolation that so often comes with an Alzheimer's diagnosis, describing himself as now part of a much larger community moving through this together. His wife Lori also spoke publicly about the diagnosis, describing him as the same steady presence he has always been, both before and after that afternoon on the Hudson, and again now. She noted that while the future remains uncertain, the family intends to keep living fully and finding meaning in ordinary, everyday moments. Medical experts are clear that there is currently no cure for Alzheimer's disease, and that symptoms typically progress over time even when the initial signs are mild. At the same time, they note that earlier detection methods and newer treatment options have given many patients diagnosed today more paths forward than were available in past decades. Longtime observers of Sullenberger's career point out that this openness is entirely consistent with the way he has always handled difficult moments. He was equally candid years earlier about experiencing symptoms resembling post-traumatic stress after the Hudson landing, and about the private grief that followed his father's death, disclosures that at the time helped normalize conversations many public figures still tend to avoid. Reporting on his recent statement has noted that he described his early symptoms using the same measured, unembellished tone that once helped calm an entire cabin of frightened passengers 30,000 feet above the ground. Alzheimer's disease affects millions of families, and when a public figure with this level of trust chooses to speak openly about an early diagnosis, it often does something that awareness campaigns alone cannot. It gives the disease a familiar, human face and pulls it further out of the shadows and into everyday conversation. His decision to publicly name his doctor and describe his treatment reflects the same faith and expertise that guided him through decades of safety work in aviation. And critically, nothing in his statement suggested a man preparing to disappear. Instead, it read as a continuation, a new chapter in which the same discipline that once defined his flying career is now being redirected to support his family and his community through what he has openly called a long and uncertain road ahead. There is something quietly fitting about the way the story is unfolding. A public identity built entirely around a single afternoon of extraordinary calm is now being tested again, not by geese striking an engine at 3,000 feet, but by something slower, quieter, and in many ways more difficult to face. And once again, rather than retreating from that difficulty, he has chosen to walk directly toward it in full view of the public, trusting that his honesty might help someone else going through the same diagnosis feel a little less alone. Those close to the family say his two daughters have rallied around him in the weeks since the news became public, describing a household that has always leaned on routine and honesty to get through hard moments, a pattern that goes back to the years when he balanced a demanding airline schedule with ordinary family life at home. Rather than letting others tell his story for him, he has continued to be the one issuing the statements and granting the occasional interview himself, choosing, once again, to remain the primary voice of his own life, rather than handing that role to someone else. That instinct, to check on everyone else before considering his own position, is the same one that made him walk the aisle of a sinking aircraft not once but twice, refusing to leave until he was certain every single passenger was accounted for. Friends and colleagues who have known him across every stage of this remarkable life say that instinct has never really changed, and they don't expect it to change now. Whether he was gliding a powerless jet toward the surface of a freezing river, testifying before lawmakers about airline safety standards, or simply telling the public the plain truth about a frightening new diagnosis, Sullenberger has consistently chosen clarity over spectacle and honesty over comfort. It is that same through line. The Texas farm boy